Okay, happy Sabbath, everyone. I pray that you had a good week that's led up to today. To begin our study, let's open with a word of prayer. Dear God, we come before you as a collective, seeking your guidance, seeking your wisdom as we navigate um, this last dispensation, as we try to understand more about what our role is at the end of the world, and what your role is in our lives, and the path that we've walked on thus far. As we look back in history and as we look forward into the future, we ask that the Holy Spirit may inspire us to seek new understanding, seek new ways of envisaging a world, a better world that's grounded on firmer principles. I pray that you may be with each and every one of us through the study and through the Sabbath as a whole. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. As I said, happy Sabbath. Just like to welcome you all to the study that we'll go through today. I invite you all to contribute where you feel you want to. As I always welcome participation, please feel free to put up your hand. And if I'm not seeing your hand, then just blurt out. But I'd prefer if you put up your hand, just so that it gives me time to finish a thought while I'm speaking, and etc. But today's study is more I won't say building off of, but I just wanted to look more broadly into a study that was done a few weeks ago on the differences between liberal and radical feminism, where we position ourselves in that and what the implications of that are in for us as a movement at the end of the world. Um, so when I say us as a movement, I'd like to explore what it means to be a movement. So other than the idea of constantly moving, but all the social political movements that exist in society, what are the core tenets? What are the key aspects of those movements? Um, and we can ask the question, do we consider ourselves a political or social movement? And so as we examine the landscape around us, the social climate, and we recognize that in a world where women's rights, racial groups' rights, ethnic rights, and human rights more broadly in general have advanced significantly over the past, I'll say, century, we're stuck with the question, why does this struggle for equality remain so pervasive and so contentious between factions of society? Um, and a key aspect to that is how we've gone about achieving that equality. And so we'll look at that through our study. Um, So if we were to think of what a movement is in general and an explanation of what a movement is, does anyone want to share their thoughts of they, how they define a movement? It can be anything. How would you define a movement to someone who wants to understand what is a movement, a social political movement?
Curtis,
Yeah.
um, first I'd like to say thank you. You just stole the topic I was going to discuss when I present. It is exactly on the similar lines. So, yeah. Anyway, to answer your question, that question has been ringing in my head for quite a while. In fact, what are we? Are we a movement? Are we a church? And how do we differentiate between the two?
Mhm.
It's still an answer that I'm looking for,
Okay.
and I hope you'll be able to answer that today.
So you've brought out this distinction between a church and a movement, or you've distinguished between them in how you've articulated what you've said, that you have churches and you have movements. So let's compare and contrast the two to see what each are, what each do, what the goals of them are. Um, Richard has written in the chat, I assume this is an answer to the question of what a movement is. It's progressive prophetic ideology. Could you explain more what you mean by that? So there's this idea of progression. Sure, you get that inherently in the word movement, to move. And then prophetic ideology. I think I understand what you mean, but could you explain a bit further, Richard?
It's a body of minds
Mm-hmm.
that are progressing on the narrow path as their minds are understanding the prophecies of the scripture and the work that the God of heaven wants to be done in their characters so that other characters can join this narrow path that is heading to the celestial city. So the prophecies are to successfully bring the conviction of sin on humanity, the power to be righteous, and then the judgment. So it's an idea, it's a mindset.
Mm-hmm.
It's the mind of Christ here on fallen earth. That's the only way I can describe it, and it probably
Sure.
can be described better,
No,
differently.
that's fine. So you've restricted your definition of the movement to us. You know, you've defined or categorized us as a movement. Um, I'm looking for a more generic answer that can be applied to any movement that exists today or has existed in the past. Susan, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I'm reading from Google.
Sure, that's fine.
And this is what Google says. It says a social movement is a loosely organized effort by a large group of people to achieve a particular goal, typically a social or a political one. This may be to carry out a social change or to resist or undo one.
Okay. And then Debbie, I saw you
Yeah,
unmuted yourself.
yeah. I was just about to ask you when you were asking about a movement, were you talking about us, or what were you asking was just what a movement was?
In
Because
general.
yes, exactly. I think that's what you were asking. I mean, I like what Susan said, but I think we need to think about types of people who come together a mind, got the same mind and ideas. So I think that when they have same mind and ideas, they come together as one to, and you think of what is the purpose of or the gender of the movement is to achieve something. So that
Mhm.
there's a gathering of people that come together, think the same, about the same minds of whatever it is they want to think about, and they come together, and the idea is that they work together to
Mhm.
achieve whatever the gender is. The end goal is to achieve something they want to achieve, to push it forward.
Yeah, yeah, I resonate with those sentiments. And so just articulating what's been said thus far, when we think of a movement, we think of people coming together, how individuals who have been separated in what they want to achieve, they decide the best way to achieve this thing is by grouping and coming together. And so we can, as Susan said, we can resist what's oppressing us or society and initiate changes within that society regarding to how people behave, the different policies that exist, the institutions or the structures that make up these societies. And as you've highlighted, Debbie, generally these people have a shared ideology or desire to address whatever problems they see in society. So when we think of politics, we recognize that there's policies that go into politics. So it's wanting to shape society around how these people with a shared ideology think society should operate. So that's what we think of when we think of movement. It's wanting to progress in a direction that fits their ideology. So Marshall's written in the chat, a group of people that as a result of change in that come together as a result of change in their positions. So it's shaping whatever societal issues are around you. So let's contrast that with a church. What is a church's primary focus? So if a movement is wanting to envisage society in a certain way, what are the goals of a church? Just to distinguish between the two. I would say a church, okay, yep, charity or blessing.
Yeah, I just wanted to say in the same way, a movement within a religious context would be also wanting to envisage religion in a certain way, because definitely when a movement, a religious movement starts, they're also either resisting something or they have progressed in a certain understanding that has, I don't know, that is not being accepted in the, if I can say, in the Orthodox Church. Yeah.
Yeah, I like how you've described that because it describes movements as an umbrella term. And within this definition of movements, you can get different types of movements. You can get religious movements, which would be your churches, because they are trying to envisage a different future for how that church, that group of people, how that society within a church's context should operate. And you get your social, more broader speaking, political movements. So to answer the question of what are we? Are we a church? Are we a political movement? What exactly are we? I would ask the question, okay, what are our goals? What is it that we're trying to change in general? I'm not going to answer that question. It's a rhetorical question. But as you think about the answer to that, just think about what it is that we're trying to achieve within ourselves. And then we'll tie this in right at the end with the conclusion that I have in store. But the key aspects to any movement that you can think of, there's many, but I have three. You have to think of the origins and causes of that movement. Where does that movement originate? Why does it originate? And what caused these people with a shared ideology to rise up and initiate this path to change? Often, movements arise from the shared grievance or dissatisfaction with the current conditions that exist within society or the group that they're a part of. And they can be triggered by specific events that escalate the tensions around society, or this gradual recognition of long-standing issues that have existed. So I'm going to give an example or ask for an example. When we think of the Millerite movement, so this is now a religious movement, what was their origins? What was the cause for the rise of that movement? We have its origins in 1798. What can you point to being the causes and origins of that movement?
I'm thinking, I don't know, it could be more than that, but I'm just thinking it has to do with how because it's a religious movement, and with a religious movement, you have sort of like a creed, right? And that creed would be the Bible in this case. And what made this Millerite movement rise was how the Bible was being interpreted in connection with the time period that they were living in, right? because I guess this religious movement also, with religion in general anyway, is a part of society, and it has a way of looking at the society around it, and the way they interpreted the Bible was going to significantly affect how things had been understood before.
Good, sis.
Yeah, carry on.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, you can.
I think another one of the causes of that, the rise of the Advent movement, was a general awakening or awareness that was coming up in American society that basically emphasized the role of the individual in a spiritual experience. So there had been for a long time this accepted notion that, in order to understand the scriptures, you had to be reliant on your bishop or your pastor, and essentially your destiny was fixed by the powers, the religious powers that be. But there was an awakening that essentially spoke contrary to that, saying individuals were able to connect with God directly. They were able to study the scriptures and understand the scriptures to a degree for themselves. And that largely their destiny was in their own hands. The decisions they made would determine where they would end up. So that's one cause I see that definitely led to the rise of the Advent movement.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting when we think about the rise of movements and how they just can't be disconnected from what's happening externally within society. So what Charity and Blessing have pointed to is that there's these religious individuals that are coming out of the Dark Ages, the 1260, and they look at how the papal church has run society in general. Remember that this period of the 1700s is also the Great Enlightenment. It's not just this recognition of individuals' rights within a church body, but that stems from these religious people looking at individuals in society, saying we have individual rights and the freedom to think how we think, separate to how the papacy demands us to think. You have, in that time period, we can point to scientists who were killed at the behest of the papal church because they thought differently. And so you have this drive for freedom from this oppressive tyranny. We have John Locke writing his papers on individual liberty. And so now you have religious people tagging onto this and saying, hold on, the same thought that we should be free from this tyranny of kings is applicable to how we view spiritual matters. And so the origins and causes are not distinct from what's happening in society, but they tied, they connected. And we'll see this further on when we consider feminism as it grew in the 1960s. So as we pointed out, there's long-standing grievances that religious individuals have had with the papal experience, the way in which the papal church has defined that religious experience with God. And so now they set goals and objectives for their movement. We're tired of how society has operated under kings, under papal rule. So let's seek to achieve something different. And so those goals or social or political movements, those goals of social or political movements can range from specific legislative changes, so changes in the laws, or more broadly speaking, societal reforms. Within a religious context, for the Millerites, it was reforms in how they viewed their relationship to Scripture, to the Bible, and how they interpreted Scripture, and how they interpreted their experience with God. So the secondary question is, speaking of the Millerite movement, what was their goal? What was their objective? So we've gone from what their origins and causes were. We have individuals coming together who are tired of long-standing issues that have plagued the Dark Ages. So what's their goal now? What's their objective?
Was it also a bit later that the Sabbath came in, or I know it wasn't kind of straight away?
It was later, but let's think of what the goal was. Was their goal to observe the Sabbath when this movement rose? Or
No.
so yeah, what could have been their goal or objective in having this movement in the first place?
Okay, I'm thinking
Getting away from Catholicism.
So Sidri said that they have this, because of these long-standing issues, they want to move away from this papal way of thinking, of relating to each other or reading the Bible and etc. I think there's more we can flesh out from that. Emma, you have your hand up.
I was just thinking, I don't think they set out to be a movement. That's the first thing. But I think their goal initially was to prepare the world for the second coming, or at least to teach the second coming of Christ.
So there's this idea of preparation for the second advent.
Yeah. And
Charity?
Yeah, I just wanted to say pretty much similar to what Emma said, that they were trying to raise awareness to the people of the end of the world, basically.
Yep. So
can I add to that as well?
Go on.
Yeah, in connection with that, it's not different, but I think they wanted to educate society about destruction of earthly governments. I say that because there was a very common popular idea during that time, that what was actually going to happen in the near future with the rise of the United States and these liberal governments is 1,000 years of peace. So the Millerites organized around an idea that not only challenged that, but dismantled the entire thing, and wanted to explain to people that actually destruction is going to happen, not earthly peace as we expect. So there's going to be the destruction of all earthly governments and earthly systems. So it's connected with what Emma and Charity said about the idea of the second man.
So their goals were more educational, if we can say that, because there was this recognition that under I think it was John Darby, millennialism, if I'm not mistaken, there was this belief that there'll be 1,000 years of prosperity, the millennium that will precede the advent of Jesus' coming. And so to destroy that idea, they had to educate people using time, using prophecy, that Jesus' coming precedes that, actually. And Jesus, God, us, will set up a new kingdom after these kingdoms have been destroyed. So their goal was education to prepare for the second advent and the implications of that. Another example that we can give is just feminist movements, broadly speaking. So not the different branches, but feminist movements, broadly speaking, seek to address the gender inequalities that they see in society. Black Lives Matter, racial rights movements seek to address racial inequalities. So when we think of goals and objectives, I want us to keep in mind that a movement rises due to causes. It has goals and objectives that it wants to reach. And then the third thing are the methods and tactics that they use to achieve those goals. And it's these two that I'd want us to keep at the forefront of our minds as we go through the studies, is that methods and tactics can be different for achieving those goals between movements. So when we think of the Millerite movement, a method or a tactic that they used was evangelism. We think of the disciples, their goal, whatever their goal was, they used evangelism, going out and spreading the word of XYZ. When a politician is running for government, they send out their party's manifesto. And within that manifesto is the party's goals and the steps that they're going to use to achieve those goals. So let's keep those two things distinct. I have to stress this point because it's integral to the further points that we make, that this goal and the steps used to achieve those goals are two distinct things. The way to achieve those goals are two distinct matters. So you can have your goal, but how are we going to reach that goal? What's the path that we're going to use to reach that goal? Can be different. So two parties could have the same goal, but how they're going to achieve that goal can be different. So let's take a look back at first wave feminism. Let's look at its origins, its goals, and how it sought to achieve those goals. It's difficult to pinpoint a specific date within first wave feminism. This idea of first wave, or splitting the eras of feminism into waves, is contentious within itself. But if we just stick to this simple model of eras that we have in feminist thought, we'll keep it within American Western feminism, just for simplicity. But a key turning point with the fight for women's rights was in 1848, when you have the first formal women's rights convention within America. And at the time, what we now call first wave feminists, they were influenced by this collective activism of women in various forms, or they were influenced by collective activism of women in different reform movements. So as we said, at that time, there's different social issues that are converging America at the very same point. So we have women participating in the French Revolution in France. Remember, the French Revolution inspired the American Revolution, or vice versa. They're happening in tandem, should I say. And so women look to the French Revolution and see women fighting for their rights in that. We have the temperance movement that's happening at the same time as well, which women have an active part in playing. And we have the abolitionist movement. Again, women have an active role in the abolitionist movement. Women up until that time had, to a large degree, been excluded from public life completely and didn't have many rights. They didn't have a say. They couldn't speak up in public spheres, and whatever legal rights that were afforded to citizens, women were excluded from. And so these are the origins. This is the cause and the origins. Exclusion from public life, the lack of rights, and seeing that they want to change. They want to be seen as citizens within this new emerging society, America. That's the goal. That's the origin, that's the cause. What's the goal of first wave feminists at that time? Anyone want to venture what the goals were of first wave feminists? What do you know about first wave feminists?
It was to be able to vote, I think, and to have equality.
Sure.
And to overturn the objectives, I think, to gender equality.
So they recognize that because in this new emerging democracy, this new system that's moving away from kingship is excluding women the rights that men have in the right to vote, they aren't equal. And so a goal of first wave feminists is to achieve that equality with regards to the right to vote. That was the central goal, if we want to say. There's other we'll say attached goals, but when we think of first wave feminists, the first thing that usually comes to people's minds is suffrage, is unlocking that right to vote. These are the infamous suffragettes. The 19th Amendment being the hallmark of first wave feminism, and the focus on equality was mainly from a legal perspective. Coming from having no political power, the fight was focused on achieving women's political power. So it's all about legal rights. Within what America had built up until that point, they had no legal rights. So women stood up and said, let's go and get our legal rights. And so the different legal rights that have been won in the past century, I'll just name 3, is the right to vote, reproductive rights, although we see that being curtailed, marital rights. And so I want us to explore just these 3 and understand how they fit within the broader ideas of liberal feminism and radical feminism. So here's the goal: the right to vote, reproductive rights, marital rights. Let's think about how we address those problems now. Women have been excluded from society. So first wave feminists stand up and say, let's include them. How are we going to include them into this existing society? How can we go from having no right to vote to having the right to vote? And we recognize that in seeking that right to vote, it's seeking to integrate into the existing system of electing government. So this is where we're going to compare and contrast between liberal feminists and radical feminism in that goal and how we go about achieving that goal. Both movements, as I'm sure we can both attest to, recognize that women are not treated equally to men. Women are second-class citizens, and so the goal and objective is equality between the sexes. And that can be applicable to the races, to classes, to age, whatever dimension of status a person holds within society. It's seeking to achieve that equality. Another term or another way of thinking of what liberal feminism is mainstream feminism. Why do we associate liberal feminism with mainstream feminism? So what do we mean by mainstream feminism? Anyone can venture to say what comes to mind when they think of mainstream feminism. Or mainstream, what does it mean for something to be mainstream?
Wait.
Hello?
Hello.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of I'm not sure if it's correct, but I'll just attempt.
Go for it.
So when I think of mainstream, I generally think of something that's more, if I can say, more accepted, or it's more within the existing system, and what is more widely known or more popular, if I can say.
Sure.
So if we are speaking about mainstream feminism, this is the type of feminism that we're seeing that is existing within that system that is there, and it's the one that's representing feminism, the feminist movement, and the one that is popularly known. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Or generally accepted.
Yeah. So there's this idea of popularity. And when we think about popularity, we can think of it as being widespread. It's something that already exists because it's widespread. So when you mentioned that it addresses what already exists, what comes to mind is looking at society, looking at what exists in the political landscape, the legal structures, And it's seeking to achieve this gender equality through gradual reforms by bringing women into the political mainstream. So by bringing women from being excluded, from having no right to vote, into the political mainstream, what is normal, what is popular. It's popular to vote. It's something that is done more generally speaking. So how can we include women in this popular thing? Let's bring them into the existing structure, into the existing system. And so your right to vote can be seen as getting women from not having that right to vote into the political mainstream. Does that make sense? Does that resonate with what you said, Charity?
I'm still trying to think if it does. I guess, yeah, the whole idea of mainstream and something being what is generally accepted within that context. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have democracy that's risen up in fighting against this idea of royalty and royal blood and kingship. And it's become the mainstay of American political thought. Democracy, we vote for our elected officials. So that's mainstream. That's what's done in America. And women see that they are not doing this thing that men have, this voting. They're not part of the political mainstream. So how can we get women into that political mainstream? It's by giving women the right to vote, to be part of that system. Yeah? So when we think of liberal feminism in general, we recognize that it's progressive. So it's a movement. It's wanting to take steps in the right direction. It's inclusive of wanting to include women in society while broadly supporting the existing institutions of power in your liberal democratic societies. So as Natalie said in the chat, and what I'm trying to point out is that it's wanting to achieve equality that works within the structure of mainstream society by integrating women, people of color, people of different ethnicities into that already existing structure. If we take the word liberal and think of its root Latin word, it means to be free. So the Latin word is liber, I think. That's the root of the word liberal. It means to be free. So in this context of liberal feminism, we can think of it as freedom from oppressive gender norms, freedom from oppressive gender laws or practices that restrict women's autonomy and their ability to fully participate in all aspects of existing society. So these core principles arise in seeking that freedom. It's equality and individual rights, it's grounded in this classical liberal philosophy of equal rights. And we can see how this is birthed in 1798, coming out of the Dark Ages, where individuals have no rights, have no freedom of self-expression. And it asserts that women, speaking specifically in the context of feminism, should have the same individual rights as men in politics, in economy, in different social spheres of influence. And it's this ideology that ultimately seeks to liberate women. It's liberating by giving them the equal rights that men have, enabling them to make choices about their own lives freely and equally. personal.
Curtis,
Go for it. Yeah, Cedric.
Black women weren't included in the first wave feminism.
Yep, they weren't, and we'll get to why they weren't. When we contrast what radical feminism seeks to achieve. So central to this idea of liberal feminist thought is the belief in personal autonomy and self-determination. It argues that women should have the ability to define their own paths in life, their own careers, education, personal relationships, all the barriers that exist. Women should be free to achieve those things because of the lack of freedom that has existed for millennia to do those things. And we can go on and on and on. But to highlight this, and I think Natalie's pointed it out in the chat, is that unlike what we can think of more radical forms of feminism that are calling for a complete overhaul of societal systems, liberal feminists work within existing structures to facilitate that change. And so it's liberation through integration and not separation. So it's liberation in seeking for liberation through integration. How can we integrate women into the existing structures and systems? Not necessarily separate them because they have been separate, but how can we integrate them? So let's look at, now that we have an understanding of the goals, equality, and how those goals are going to be achieved of liberal feminist thought, let's look back at the Bible and assess whether, assess what kind of methods, we'll say God or the biblical authors, used in seeking the goals that God had for God's people. If we can open Exodus 21, verse 2 to 6, could someone post that in the chat? So it's liberation through integration, looking at society and seeing what already exists and seeing how people, in this context women or people of color, can be integrated into that society to make their lives better. So they're coming from a bad place and we want to make their lives better. How do we do that?
What was that again? Was that Exodus, what, 20?
21, verse 2 to 6. Could you read that, Emma?
Yes, Exodus 21, 2 to 6. If thou buy an Hebrew servant, 6 years he shall serve, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. If he came in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he were married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master have given him a wife, and she have borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out by himself. And if the servant shall plainly say, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him unto the judges. He shall also bring him to the door or unto the doorpost. And his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall serve him forever.
And then verse 7 to 11. Sorry, I was meant to post that as well. Verse 7 to 11 as well.
Shall I read that?
Mm-hmm.
And if a man sell his daughter to be a maidservant, she shall not go out as the men servants do. If she please not her master who hath betrothed her to himself, then shall he let her be redeemed. To sell her unto a strange nation, he shall have no power, seeing he hath dealt deceitfully with her. And if he have betrothed her unto his son, he shall deal with her after the manner of daughters. If he take him another wife, her food, her raiment, and her duty of marriage shall he not diminish. And if he do not these three unto her, then shall she go out free without money.
So here we have this system that exists within the world that the Israelites find themselves in. They've come out of Egypt, and prior to Egypt, for years prior to the Israelite captivity, there's this political, social norm. What is prevalent? It's slavery. It's slavery between ethnicities. It's slavery of daughters. And so what does God want to do with the Israelites? He recognizes that this is abhorrent, what the Egyptians have done, how they've perverted, or how the Egyptian ideology has perverted my Israelites. So God takes them out of Egypt and now is teaching them, instructing them of how they are to relate to slaves. What's God's goal and what are God's methods to achieving that goal? In these examples that we've read through. While someone answers that, could we post Leviticus 25 verse 44 to 46 as well?
You know, with that other one, are you saying that could we say that God made laws to the slave?
Yes. So God has laws for the slave. I'll come back to you, Deborah.
Okay.
But could you read Leviticus 25 verse 44 to 46?
25,
It's
44.
posted in the chat here.
All right, sorry, I'm reading it on my phone now. 44 to where?
46.
Right. Both thy bondmen and thy bondmaids, which thou shalt have, shall be of the heathen that are round about you. Of them shall you buy bondmen and bondmaids. Moreover, of the children of the strangers that do sojourn among you, of them shall you buy, and of their families that are with you, which they beget in your land, and they shall be your possession. And ye shall take them as an inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them for a possession. They shall be your bondmen forever. But over your brethren, the children of Israel, ye shall not rule one over another with rigor.
So Moses, as representative of God, recognizes that slavery is embedded into society. Wherever they look around them, there's slavery. So God wants to get them to an end goal of perfection, if we want to say, of abolishing slavery. That's the ultimate desire. But how are we going to get to that end goal? And so what Moses writes, being inspired by God, is, okay, let's just make the lives of the Israelites better than they were before. So instead of abolishing this entire institution of slavery, let's see what rights we can give Israelites, what rights we can give other ethnicities within this existing structure. Would you say that that's, or this advice or these laws are coming from how we described liberal feminist approaches? Liberation through integration. Does anyone see that differently? So if you don't see that differently, we can look at another example, Paul. And I'm glad that Ignatius, Charity.
Okay, I'm not. So by you saying, do I see it differently? It's the idea of what Moses basically says about slavery to the Israelites, how he deals with the situation, and you you're equating it, or rather comparing it with the approach of liberal feminism. Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay, I haven't really thought through much on it. I will, but for some reason I disagree.
Explain.
And I guess the reason why I sort of disagree is because of generally how, when we look at with the reform movements that have occurred over time, how God has sought to radically change things with the different generations. It might not look radical to us, but it's what, however God was approaching the problem or the situation in that time, it was in a radical fashion. I would have to think through it more, but
Okay.
that's my thought.
Sure.
I could.
Go, Blessing.
Yeah, I think I agree with you actually, on this one. Because if we're going to be true to the definition of radical looks at the root and deals with things at the root. And I don't think it was possible for God to do that before the time of the end. So I won't say much about that, but I personally believe that Adventism is unique in terms of what it can achieve in the world that it lives in at the time of the end. Prior to the time of the end, because of how the world was, I don't think it was possible to abolish the existing structure. So when God set up the nation of Israel, yes, they did things, or they were meant to do things differently to their pagan counterparts, but they were essentially doing the same thing. So slavery wasn't removed. They were just told, treat your slaves nicely and don't make your fellow Israelites slaves. That in and of itself is not radical. I know it can be foreign, it can be strange to people that have been used to seeing brutality. So definitely it is a change, but I wouldn't see it as a radical change based on what we believe and understand radical to be, because we say radical is overhaul the system. And the reform movement of Moses did not overhaul the system of slavery. So when we're speaking within the context of slavery, then definitely that was not a radical approach. I think we have to be honest about that. You know, there may be other things that we achieved in the reform movement of Moses that were radical, but the system of slavery isn't that.
So I want to just highlight a point that was made by what you said, is I want us to look at radical feminism and liberal feminism through, that's why I stressed it at the beginning, of how they are going about achieving those changes. And if we can put them into boxes of looking at an existing system and what we do with that existing system. So this system in this context is slavery. Liberal feminism, remember what I said just a few moments ago, seeks to integrate or liberate humans, society, women, men, different ethnic groups, liberate them from past oppression through integrating them into that system. And so if we can put it in a catchphrase, it's treat people better within this system. So if we understand liberal feminism through that lens, is let's take people from this thing where they've been treated badly and let's treat them better in this existing system. Radical feminism would look at that system, and a key word that was brought out was the root. So it looks at the problem and says, okay, people are being treated badly. How do we address people that are being treated badly? Let's uproot the system entirely. Because when we think of the term, the personal is political, at those group meetings that women had in the 20th century, where that paper was written, I can't remember her name. If someone remembers her name, they can write it in the chat, about what it means for the personal to be political. It's a recognition that you, as a woman, your personal injustices are not separate, indistinct events. It's not happening within your marriage solely. It's a result of the structures, the systems, and the processes that exist politically in society in general. So if we want to address your abusive marriage, we're not going to address it completely by just getting that one bad apple to change. It's by addressing the system that gives rise to abusive marriages, by addressing what power looks like, by addressing gender roles, and etc., etc. So it's looking at the root of the problem. And if any of you have been gardening, when you go to a garden and you look at weeds and you just pull out the stem of the weed, all that happens is that weed grows back. And so instead, you have to dig and take out that weed from its roots. And so radical feminism looks at that system and says, let's envisage a new system entirely, not one that has already existed. So when we look back at what Carol Hanich, thank you, Emma. She's the person that wrote the paper that was given the title, The Personal is Political. If any of you want to go and read that further. But when we look back at those verses of what Moses was trying to achieve and what God was trying to achieve with regards to slavery specifically, and we ask ourselves a question, okay, that system, what was being done to it? What was being done to it in that context was that people were being treated better. Okay, we're not going to change the system because it's impossible. So let's get our Israelites to treat fellow Israelites better and get Israelites to treat foreign slaves better than they were being treated in this system already. And we see this represented or reflected in Paul's advice to the runaway slave. What was his name? Whatever his name was. Onesimus.
Mm.
He gives him the advice that, Onesimus, go back to your slave master and pray that he treats you nicely. So I'm not going to tell you to run away from your slave entirely, because you're just going to be brought back into that system anyway. So the best that you can do is hope for a good slave master that will treat you better, because slavery had been so embedded into society. The very fabric of how society ran and was operated was patriarchal. And I use the term patriarchal in its broader sense of how we think about power relations. So let's go to another example. Ignatius, you did a presentation a while back on Paul's pragmatic advice. I don't know if Nyasha is on the call as well, because she did one similar. What were some of the pragmatic changes that Paul instituted in his dispensation? Before we do that, I can see Brian has his mic unmuted.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, in general, as a principle, I believe that God does not act radically, generally, because if he did, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. We would have dealt with the sin problem long back. God's idea of dealing with his creation is working with them. God does not want to be so radical that he divides people without giving them a chance to come round. So, and he showed that when, I keep saying he, excuse me, God showed that through Jesus. When Jesus came to this earth, Jesus showed that he wants to change people, you know, not in a radical sense, but to show the character of whom the Godhead is. So along those lines, basically what I'm saying is God does not always act radically. I know that there would be instances where there is some radical change.
Sure. It keeps coming up in discussions of what radical feminism is or radical change is. And I think it's easy for us to think of attaching the word radical to going further than where society currently is. So if we were to think of Ellen White and how she related to women by advocating for women to go to work, by advocating for not fully wearing pants, but the reform dress and all the different things that Ellen White stood for that were far-reaching. They were different from where society currently was. We associate radical with that notion. But I want us to think of radical specifically in relation to addressing the system. So getting to the root of the problem. So by getting women to wear pants, I'll come to you, sorry. Are we addressing the root of the problem, or are we addressing a pimple of that problem? Yeah, blessing.
No, someone is complaining here that she had a hand up. So
Oh, sorry, I
wait.
never saw your hand. Sorry, Charity. Yeah, go for it.
Thank you. Okay, so I just want to go back to what I said before. I then understood the perspective you are coming from and looking at the system and specifically the issue of slavery in terms of radical and liberal. I understand what you're saying. And I just wanted to say something in connection with what I had been saying before about radical in this sense. Maybe it's a different perspective from the one that you're coming from. And I was just looking at how generally God has been bringing humanity from dispensation to dispensation to closer to, if I can say, to what was there originally, right? So I was looking at it from that aspect that in as much as it was progressive, because it has to be progressive, right? And like Brian is saying, God works with people in the different dispensations based on the light that they have. And in that sense, that's where I was now saying, if you were to teleport yourself back to that time that the Israelites lived and the world, the society around them, and how things happened, how God was actually establishing that Israelite nation and telling them to basically, if I can say, change the way they were doing things and treating people in that history, it was completely different from what society was used to in that time. So in that sense, that's where I was coming from and saying it was quite radical in that sense. And this is how we have seen God dealing with things or doing things with every reformatory movement. Yeah.
Mhm. I hear you, and I hear the point that my dad was making, and that we can look at these different reformatory movements and see how God has done things differently or extremely differently to how they were being done. Women getting the right to vote was extremely different to how it was done before. Saying to the Israelites, don't enslave your fellow kin, enslave foreigners, but treat them nicely. But your fellow Israelites don't enslave. That was extremely different, because in society at that time, under the Babylonian kingdom, under the Egyptian kingdom, under the Grecian kingdom, slavery was pervasive, whether it was your own ethnic group or foreigners. So it was extremely different. But what I want us to see is that radical feminism and radical change is not necessarily tied to being extremely different. It's how the problem is being addressed. Is it addressing the root of that system by envisaging a different system completely? Or is it making amendments to that system to see how people can be treated better?
Good.
Yep.
Just to let you know that you just
Can I
heard
say
Noah.
something quickly?
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, in connection with what you were saying as well, that I don't think the change that has come in prior reform movements, when we speak about the subject of slavery, because it seems like we're focusing on slavery in particular, you know, it wasn't radical. Definitely it was different. And I'm not saying it was bad or it was even common. It was probably uncommon, but I don't think it was radical. If we're going to be strict to the definition of the word, that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to say is, like Elder Paminda said, I think we approach the subject of liberal feminism as if it's a dirty term and a dirty movement, you know, like a bad movement that has done and did bad things. And I think looking at it that way and approaching it that way is, you know, having taken time to think about it myself, I think it's very problematic to categorize liberal and radical as good and bad. You know, I think that does injustice to both, really. And I feel often that's where we trip, you know, when we then say the work that was done wasn't radical. We then think the work that was done was bad, if you get what I'm saying. That because we already approached the subject with the premise, liberal is bad, radical is good. So if we then go back and say, what God told the Israelites to do in their society was not radical, we then think, oh, so you're saying what God told Israel to do was bad, you know? And probably instead of trying to force what God did in prior reformatory movements to be radical, we should rather deal with the root of our thinking, which is, you're saying, what is liberal feminism? How does it approach dealing with the problem? What's radical feminism? How does it approach dealing with the problem? Is one good or bad, or we have to have a totally different way of thinking about these two approaches of dealing with things, if you get what I'm saying? Yeah. Then the last point I wanted to make was, I think we are a movement of parables, like we teach parables. And one thing that parables teach us is you always have to know your story or your subject. A parable will not address every subject, you know. So when you're dealing with something specific, you have to stick to that story. Once you start mixing stories, it becomes confusing. So, for example, if you go back to the history of Moses, I think there were things that were radical done in that history. One radical thing that was done was the change of the religious system. The religious system was completely overhauled, because if you remember, prior to the reformatory movement of Moses, the firstborns were the leaders, the religious and spiritual leaders of the family, because it wasn't really a nation yet, but of the family of Israel. You know, if you were the eldest male, then you would essentially have the responsibilities and the duties of the priest. But once you got into the reform movement of Moses, God changed that and said, you know what? We're doing away with the system of the firstborn completely. We're now establishing a Levitical priesthood, and the Levitical priesthood is being established based on merit. They understood true worship in the golden calf incident and in another incident afterwards. But the golden calf incident was what established them, that's where God made the decision that, you know what, I'm going to make the tribe of Levi my spiritual representatives because they stood on the right side of the worship issue or the religious issue. So you can definitely see an overhaul there. When you even go to Numbers chapter 3, God says, all those firstborn that were there, we're going to replace them with Levites now. And there were 273 less Levites, I think, to make up for the firstborn. So what I'm just saying is, if we're talking about slavery, that's one story. Definitely not radical. Definitely, progressive change. It's the good change that God did. Treat your slaves nicely. Don't make slaves of Israelites, etc. But not radical. Get rid of firstborn. Establish Levitical priesthood based on merit. I think that is, in a sense, radical because you are getting rid of the entire system and establishing a new system. So yeah, that's the point I just wanted to make is I think we also need to know what our story is and where to apply an issue. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I wanted to go through different histories to show how God has had to, if I can say, be a liberal feminist regarding certain issues because of how embedded those issues were in society, because of what limits God had and what limits society had in general. So we've spoken about Moses and one issue, slavery. We can go to Paul and we think about how Paul related to women. And so, Ignatius, could you, if you're there, remind us what was the verse that you brought up in your study about how Paul was pragmatic with regards to women's rights? So remember, the core of Paul's message was equality. Yeah, Ignatius.
It was First Corinthians chapter. I think it's around chapter 14, verse 34, that says it is a shame for a woman to speak in church. And going to the immediate context, you are speaking under a context whereby women were not allowed or were not supposed to speak in public under the Roman establishment or the Roman government. A society was well ordered, and it was ordered in a manner that it is the men who were supposed to be the leaders of the home, be it the firstborn male member, if the dad is not around or the father is dead or is not around, then the mother. Then number 3 was the children. Number 4, the relatives. Number 5 being the workers. And then number 6, the servants. So that was the strict order that was required by the government and was actually enforceable at law. So in public, women were not allowed to speak. And it was actually a legal requirement that women in public would not speak. And this is a new system whereby we now have church, we have churches, and the debate now, or the complication was, is church public or private? You see now. So Paul then gives advice because he does not want to incite persecution from the government. And then he advises to say, look, doesn't society even tell you or show you that it is shameful for women to speak in church? Rather, they should go back home and ask during the dinner table, maybe to their husbands or whoever. There was a change there in that even at home, women were not allowed to ask. They would just go and apply what has been said. But the fact that Paul is actually giving room for women to have conversation with regards to what has been said at church in itself shows some change in terms of how he's managing the situation here, and how he's advocating a change in society, and also allowing the people like what was the name, Fabi and Priscilla,
Mhm.
yeah, to teach in their church homes, because those church were in homes, so they were private. So
Yeah.
you would say, well, they can take up and also teach, you see.
Mhm.
So when you read it and you don't have context, it becomes very complicated if you
Mhm.
don't understand the society under which all this was happening. Because at some point in time, he says women should just keep quiet, and at some
Yeah.
point in time, he recommends women to actually teach. You see,
Yeah.
so he is moving. He doesn't want to choke them; rather, he's moving with them slowly.
Mhm.
You see, giving them what they can chew.
Yeah. So we have two issues. One is this issue where Paul addresses the problem in a liberal feminist way, where he sees how men are entitled to knowledge, or if we can see knowledge as this system that's existed within society. The structures of knowledge are so that women are excluded. Up until this point, in private and public life, women were excluded from being entitled to knowledge, from reaching for knowledge, from speaking publicly and sharing their thoughts of knowledge. And so Paul, being pragmatic, says, okay, let's look at this existing system and how we philosophize about the world of who owns knowledge. How can we get women into that system? Let's women have conversations with your husbands at home. Let's start there as a stepping stone. In a different sphere, baptism, with regards to one's religious experience with God, is radically different. So this goes back to the point that Blessing was making, is that when you're dealing with a story, you have to stick within the confines of that story. So if we're talking about knowledge and women's place with regards to oratory in life, we can see that as liberal feminist methods, integrating women into the existing system. In a different story, an individual's experience with God, we can see that it's something that's radically different. We recognize that prior to the dispensation of Christ, women's attachment to God was secondary. It was in tangent or in connection to their husbands or to their fathers through circumcision. So the only way for a woman to have a religious experience with God was through their husband or through their father. And now Paul comes and says, let's radically change the system of one's religious experience. Now, baptism or the gospel is open to everyone, to man and woman, to slave and free, and you can have that connection with Christ individually. It's a completely different system, and that's radical. So it's not radical because it's extreme or far-reaching. It's radical because it's a new system. It's demolished the old system of religious experience and set up a new one. Whereas with regards to knowledge, it's liberal, not because it's bad, but because that's what could be done given the existing societal structures. So God is always doing both with whatever issues they can do both with. We've got 10 minutes left, and I wanted to go on to a different thought, but I don't know, maybe I could take this evening's study, Emma, and we can carry on there.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So if we keep these thoughts in our minds, we're going to go from this understanding that in different dispensations, God has to address things either radically different by uprooting that system or through a liberal feminist lens by integrating people into that system. We can discuss the reasons why God approaches different matters these ways differently later. But I hope that you all join us later for that discussion, because there's a few examples that I want to go through of where we can see these distinctions, and perhaps it will become clearer what these distinctions are. And then finally, we can wrap it up with, okay, why are we radical feminists, and what are the implications of being radical feminists on us as a movement? Are we a movement? Are we a church? Well, what are the implications of everything that we've discussed on that? But we'll have to get into that later, because I've still got a lot to go through.
Okay,
But
Ken,
mhm.
could you repeat what you've just said
Which
about
part?
it looks like radical feminism. God is moving with both radical and liberal. Is that what you were saying?
Mhm. So it's that in every dispensation, there's various issues that God wants to address. God has goals within a dispensation, but how they go about achieving those goals will be different, that are specific to that issue. So the two examples that I gave was the system of I'm struggling for a different term, but if we can say knowledge, who's entitled to knowledge? And by that, I mean, who's entitled to speak about their thoughts, to define knowledge, to define truth. We have that system. And then we have another system, and I'm going to, if someone can give me a better word, but I'm going to put it under the umbrella of baptism or religious experience.
Oh, okay. So God is dealing with this society in a multifaceted way. Is
Yes.
applying wisdom in how he's dealing with the problems that the society is facing.
In
Okay.
in one aspect, God will create a new system, a new
Okay.
means of thinking about society, and that we see reflected in baptism, where women get baptized now, slaves get baptized. It's a completely different way of thinking about the problem, where prior it was just through attachment to, well, first of all, only Israelites, and then through attachment to a husband or a father. So that's radically different, because it's the root is being addressed. Whereas knowledge, as you articulated, it's integrating. How can God integrate women into the system? By saying, okay, don't have your debates in public, do them in private. As you said, prior to that, women weren't even allowed to have those debates with their husbands in private. But as a liberal feminist, let's look at this system. How can we integrate women into it? So God will look at different issues and address them differently. And we'll debate or speak about the reasons why God does them differently later today.
Okay.
Blessing or charity? Yeah.
That's me. So basically, what we are saying is that God generally wants to achieve a goal, right? And we have a different, if we can say, facets, or no, not facets, different groups. I don't know if it's different groups of people, but there's different facets of society, if I can say. And God has reached those people in different ways to achieve the same thing, if we're saying. And God has also raised a particular group that represents their kingdom and is going to be the embodiment of God's principles. So, in that sense, this particular group is the primary representation of God's kingdom, And then with the other, because humanity also needs salvation, right? And in order to reach those different groups of people, or in order to achieve the ultimate goal, God has also used different methods, if I can say, of reaching them. Is that what you're saying? I know I said a lot of things, but I don't know if that makes sense.
Kind of, because you said a lot of things. But
I
what I
know.
understood by what you said is that God will use different methods to achieve a different goal, not to achieve the same goal, but because of where society is and certain limitations, God has to use different methods.
Yes.
Is that fair
And
to say?
then, yes, and then at the same time, God will still raise up a primary group that represents who God is, like which will represent the principles of God's kingdom, you know.
I
Like
see it
what
that
we
way.
are saying with the movement right now. With the movement, there's certain requirements that are there for us based on the knowledge that we have, and then with the other people elsewhere, God has reached them with the knowledge that they have. If you get what I'm saying.
Yep, I get what you're saying.
Pedro, can I ask you a
Kurt,
question? Sorry.
these
Um,
requirements.
Sorry, I don't know who spoke first.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask a question, quick question, before Jerry mutes.
Go for it.
Yeah, the question is, are you going to, by any chance, talk about Protestant Reformation in the evening?
Could you elaborate on your question specifically?
Yeah,
Because
like,
I did intend to, but I don't know if it's within the realm of what you're thinking of.
no, it's all right. That's all I wanted to know. If you're going to talk about it, it's fine.
Okay.
That's all. Yeah.
Yep. As I was going through these different dispensations, I covered Protestant Reformation under E.G. White as being that history. So we'll touch on that. I don't know what thoughts you have on it, but we can discuss that later. Okay, we'll pick it up this evening, but thank you for your participation. I've tried to labor the same point in different ways over and over again. So if it doesn't make sense, please just message me and let me know, and I'll try and use a different way of explaining what's on my mind at least. Because I really do think that the implications of it are integral to what our purpose is. And so yeah, if anything doesn't make sense, please just speak. Yeah.
I think Ignatius had wanted to say something the same time
Okay,
Blessing
yeah.
spoke.
Yeah, Ignatius. So I'll go Ignatius, then Natalie. Sorry, I just forgot.
Oh, okay. I want to say that the rules that are being said by Paul are applying to that group. I remember you were having a discussion with Charity, and Charity was saying God will then raise another group that represents what God really wants. So, according to my understanding, what's being written in Corinthians, for example, is actually applying to that group. So the rules of God integrating both methods, this more radical method and this more liberal method, are applying to the ideal group that God is actually raising. I don't know if I'm not now confusing you.
Yeah, I hear your point. I have to think about it a bit more. But
yeah.
we'll close for now.
Okay.
Can you
All right.
reiterate the point? Sorry.
Do you want to say your point again, Ignatius? I think Ignatius's point was that because Paul was speaking to Christian women, the thought is that God's raised up this group, Christians, and so God is going to address them through a radical feminist lens or through a liberal feminist lens, and that's not just applicable to wider society, but it's applicable to that group that God is raising up. And that's demonstrated by the fact that the pragmatic advice, if you want to call it that, was given to those Christians that God was raising up. the thing that I need to think about with what you said, Ignatius, is we recognize that on our line, for instance, we have the line of the 144,000, then we have the line of priests, Levites, and Ethnims. Do we think that the 144,000 are separate and distinct in what God is trying to achieve with them, versus what God is trying to achieve with the other groups? And so I don't know. That's why I said I need to think about it more, but that's what came to mind.
Okay.
Okay, so let's close with the word of prayer.
Can I just say my point?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry, sorry, as my mind keeps
I just
forgetting
wanted
who's wanted to
to
say something.
just remind us, Curtis, of the two things that you mentioned at the beginning of your study that all movements are using. What was those two things?
Is that every movement has a goal, so wanting to achieve something, and then to get to that goal or that destination or that objective, there's a method or a means of getting to that goal. And so where two movements can have the same goal, they may have different methods of achieving that goal.
You didn't mention the methods. Do you know them, or are we coming to that place where we're all trying to give the same answer?
I think I integrated that into my discussion of liberal and radical feminists, is that the goal is equality. And then the method is, when you look at this system that produces inequality, this method can either be to integrate women into that system that exists, or to create a new system, which would be your radical feminist school of thought.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, let's close with a word of prayer. Dear God, thank you for being with us through today's study. Thank you for giving us the space to debate ideas. I think that's integral to what it means to be a radical feminist movement. Please help us understand what you're trying to do with us here at the end of the world as a radical feminist movement. And I pray that we may look at you and what you've done with society, not in disgust, not in thinking of you as bad, but seeing the state of society and seeing what you have done, so that we can look at different movements in society, again, not with shame, but seeing them within context of wider political life. I thank you for the Holy Spirit being with us. I ask that they were with us and they continue to be with us through today, as we meet again later to continue and build on our discussion that we've just had. We praise your name. In Jesus' name, I pray. Amen. Thank you.